My name's Angus Gordon and I work as a content strategist at a small agency in Melbourne called Weave. What we really do at Weave is content strategy, but we also do a lot of work with Drupal sites, both building Drupal sites ourselves and also collaborating on Drupal sites. And this is a talk that really is about the intersection between content strategy and Drupal. So what I want to do in this talk is introduce this term, content geography. Has anyone actually come across this term before? You might not have. It's a relatively sort of new term, so I'll talk about what it means. But more importantly, I want to talk about how Drupal does content geography differently from some other content management systems. So the concept to me is most useful as a way of thinking about the differences between CMSs, and also about the way that affects you as a Drupal site builder or owner. So someone who is managing or building or thinking about building a Drupal website. So the talk is mainly aimed at those people. If we have anyone in the room who is a Drupal professional, you may not learn any new sort of information from this talk as such, but hopefully it will give you maybe some new ways of talking about these kinds of issues with your clients or your colleagues. Okay, just checking that that's working. Great. Okay, so just to start off with, what does this term content geography mean? It's actually a term that's been introduced by a writer called Dean Barker. Dean Barker is an American, basically consultant on content management systems. So he helps large organisations with a kind of CMS procurement process, essentially comparing different content management systems and working out what the right one is for them. And one thing Dean Barker noticed is that there's a sort of a feature or a difference between content management systems that doesn't get talked about very much, and it's this feature that he calls content geography. And what he means by content geography is the way that relationships between content objects are implemented in a given content management system. And by content objects, that's just a general term, if you're not familiar with it, for a kind of a self-contained piece of content. So if you know Drupal, most of our content objects in Drupal are nodes, although there are other entity types such as users and taxonomy terms that can also be content objects. But we're just talking about the kind of minimum self-contained unit of content. And a content object is typically, but not always, represented on the front end of a website as a web page. So content geography is about the relationships between these things. And Dean Barker's point is that different content management systems have different ways of doing content geography, different ways of defining relationships between their content objects. And specifically, he talks about two overall approaches. The first approach he talks about is one that involves a single kind of master content hierarchy. So one kind of system in the back end of the CMS that is the kind of master structure for the content. The second approach he talks about is one where you have sort of multiple competing structures, multiple competing ways of defining sort of relationships between content. So to explain what that sort of means in practice, the easiest way to understand it is to have a look at the editing interfaces of some different content management systems. So I've just got a few screenshots to show you. The first one, this is the editing interface in a pretty well-known commercial CMS called Episerver. Anyone ever done any work with Episerver? It's very expensive from what I understand, but this is a classic example of a CMS with a hierarchical content geography. And the way we can see that in the back end is if you look over on the left-hand side, you can see that all the content objects within the CMS are arranged in a kind of tree diagram. So it's almost as if you're looking at at software or something like that. It's a pretty familiar kind of interface for a hierarchical collection of objects. So this is the way the authors find content within the CMS. They sort of navigate through a tree structure. And when you create a new piece of content in Episerver, you have to place it somewhere within that hierarchy. So you have to decide, is this going to be a top-level page, or is it going to be a child page of another page? You're explicitly placing it within a hierarchy at the time of creation. Okay, so that's a kind of a tree structure, which is one of the very common ones. Another one which is similar, although not exactly the same, is a folder structure, and that's the kind of structure you get in this content management system, which is called Ectron, another commercial CMS. And you see it's a similar kind of deal. On the left-hand side, you've got everything organised, but this time, rather than that kind of tree structure, it's organised into folders. But again, when you create a page, you have to place it within a folder. You have to place it somewhere in the hierarchy. Okay, so let's compare this to our old friend Drupal. So this, I'm sure you're all familiar with, is the main kind of content, the main kind of list of content within a Drupal website. And as you can see, it is a list. You're not looking at any kind of hierarchy. You're looking at a list of, in this case, nodes. And it's a list that can be filtered in various ways and sorted in various ways, but none of those ways are the correct way. None of those ways are the sort of the master way of organising this content. It's all just kind of there. And this is a way of organising content that Dean Barker refers to slightly derisively as the big bucket of content approach. And he sees sort of Drupal as almost the classic case of a content system with a big bucket of content, where you don't have to. You can create a piece of content in Drupal without giving it any relationship to any other piece of content in the system. Yes, you can add a menu entry at the time of creation, but you don't actually have to. And if you do add a menu entry, it doesn't have any effect on the way that the content actually looks in the back end of the system. It's only something that affects the front end. So that's Drupal. We've got a big bucket of content. And the reality, the kind of underlying reality of that is that Drupal has multiple content geographies. It has multiple ways of defining relationships between content objects. And especially for a government audience, I like to think of this as a separation of powers. None of our kind of organising systems in Drupal do everything. And particularly if you think about the big three systems in Drupal, we've got content types, we've got menus, and we've got taxonomy. Most Drupal sites of any kind of complexity are going to use all three of those systems at one time or another. But they also don't have what you might call jurisdiction. None of them has jurisdiction over the others. There's no one of those three systems that is the boss of the others, or that sort of determines the way that the others are going to be structured. So you sort of have these multiple sort of independent systems, and then on top of those big three, you also have other ways of creating relationships between content. So you can create a direct relationship between two pieces of content using an entity reference field, for instance. And then there are contributed modules which can introduce their own completely independent content geographies. So I'm thinking of something there like organic groups, which really just introduces a completely different way of grouping and organising content. So this aspect of Drupal, the fact that it's got all these different systems and all these different ways of building relationships between content, is something that a lot of people who are new to Drupal find really confusing. And that includes Dean Barker, who is, one of the world's foremost kind of experts on content management systems. And this is a quote from a book that he's actually not published yet, but you can go to the O'Reilly website and download a sort of an early version of it, and it's a book that he's written about the whole topic of web content management. And he says, I've spent most of my career working with systems that have strong content trees. As such, my thought processes about content management systems have evolved around organising content into a hierarchy. To this day, Drupal mystifies me in this respect. I realise it's immensely popular and has thousands of adherents, but I struggle with anything that doesn't have a content tree at its core. Okay, I sort of know how he feels, because it's how I feel when I look at Joomla. It's kind of like, I just don't get this. How does this even work? So for people who are used to those kind of really hierarchical CMSs, Drupal can be really confusing, especially at first. Okay, but what difference does this actually make in practice? Is it just a matter of the way that content looks in the back end of the website? Well, actually, it has some more kind of profound effects than that, and I want to talk about two of them in particular. And the first one is the fact that if you have this kind of master content hierarchy, like one of these content trees or folder systems, that can then become the single source of truth for the front-end navigation on your website. And I'll show you, the easiest way to explain that is to show you an example. So this is a page on a website for a local council in Melbourne. And having done some work with this organisation, I happen to know this site's built in Sitecore, which is one of those CMSs that has that kind of strong kind of content tree in the back end. And one of the results of that is that if you look at a page like this, you have a ton of kind of navigational elements here. So you've got the URL of the page. You've got a menu which actually appears in sort of two different forms, as the sort of the banner across the top, and then the side menu down in the left-hand sidebar. You've got breadcrumbs appearing just above that left-hand menu. And then right down at the bottom of the page, you've got something which is actually sort of built into this system and is a default on every page, and that is a list of all the page's sub-pages. One thing you notice when you start playing around with this system is that it's very hard, because all of these navigational elements are relying on that single back-end hierarchy. They just kind of naturally match up. So it's actually very easy in Sitecore to create these kind of multiple navigational elements that all kind of sync with each other. In fact, you have to go to a fair bit of effort to make them not sync with each other. Compare that to a Drupal site. Now in Drupal, we also have multiple ways of providing navigation in the front end of a website. But compared to something like Sitecore, these are not synced by default. These don't all use the same system out of the box. So if you think of the various front-end kind of systems we have, we've got navigation menus, we've got breadcrumbs again, we've got URL patterns or URL alias patterns, which are typically defined using the Path Auto module, although I've heard that Path Auto is not quite ready for prime time on Drupal 8 yet. It's getting there, but definitely in Drupal 7 you'll be setting URL patterns using Path Auto. And then we've got various kinds of views-based navigation as well, so everything that the views module gives us to help people sort of find content on the site. It would be perfectly possible in Drupal to build a front end where every single one of these navigational elements relies upon a different structure in the back end. Of course, your navigation menus are almost always going to be taken from your menus in the back end, but you could have a site that does that and then takes its breadcrumbs from the taxonomy system. It could take its URL patterns from content types. And it could take its views-based navigation from entity references. So you could actually be using 4 different sort of back-end structures to define those 4 different sort of navigational elements on the front page. Very different. Drupal by default, these systems all kind of work independently. They're not all kind of nicely kind of synced up. The other really big difference is that in these systems with a master content hierarchy, you tend to define content editing permissions by a section of the website. So in other words, a content editor will have permission to edit a top-level page and its sub-pages. So if you work in the HR department, you'll have permission to edit the pages in the HR section. If you work in the finance department, you'll have permission to edit the pages in the finance section. As you probably know, that's not the way it works in Drupal, at least out of the box. So by default, the main way that content editing permissions are defined in Drupal is by content type. So unless your HR section of your website and your finance section of the website happen to use completely different content types, there's no way out of the box of doing that kind of section-based breakdown of permissions in Drupal. Fortunately, as with most things in Drupal, there are contributed modules that actually fill that gap and allow you to do that if that's what you really want to do. So the main one for defining permissions by section of the website is Workbench Access, which is part of the Workbench suite, and I believe that's available in GovCMS and in AGov. Don't know if anyone Anyone confirm that? Yep. So you can certainly do that in Drupal, but it's not the way it works out of the box. So to sort of summarise those points, the Drupal way is to keep these systems independent by default, and to use modules to harmonise them when we want to. So yay Drupal, right? I mean, this is one of the things that we love about Drupal, is that it gives us a whole heap of flexibility, and we don't have some kind of dictatorial master system defining all our breadcrumbs and all our URLs for us, without giving us any choice in the matter. And certainly there are great things about this sort of flexibility within Drupal, and the opportunities that it gives us to really custom design content presentation and navigation. So using things like tag-based navigation, sort of faceted browsing, or surfacing content in context using things like related content views. But there are some downsides. There are some downsides to this flexibility, and one of them is that there's a real potential to design, to build sites that have poor usability. And I'm talking about usability both for content authors and also ultimately for end users as well. So think about how easy it is in Drupal to design websites where you have, for instance, multiple menus, where you have a main menu and maybe a menu of footer links that's sort of meant to be mainly the same but not quite, so it can't use the same menu, and how easy it is for those menus to get out of sync. Sites with proliferating taxonomy vocabulary is really common in Drupal. It's so easy to create in Drupal it's as easy to create a new vocabulary as it is to create a new term, or almost as easy. Whereas a lot of other systems, you actually have to jump through hoops to create a custom taxonomy, so people don't tend to do it as much. So you often end up with Drupal sites with just reams of vocabularies, and half of them are duplicating each other, and some of them nobody really knows what they're supposed to be for. Really major one for me is URLs, menus and breadcrumbs not lining up when you would expect them to. So having a URL structure, a menu structure and a breadcrumb structure that aren't consistent. And also just shallow or unhelpful URL structures, so URLs that don't actually give you much information about the page that you're looking at. So I've got an example of this. Is Jenny Cody in the room? No, she's not. It's a pity. Jenny's someone we know who works for the courts in Victoria. This is the County Court website in Victoria, built in Drupal. One of the first things you'll see on this website is that it does have a fairly poorly conceived information architecture, and that's not something you can blame Drupal for. It's something that you could easily sort of do on any site really. But the one thing I really want to point out on this site is that compare this breadcrumb to this URL, okay? So we've got breadcrumbs which are clearly representing the fact that this page is 3 levels deep on the site. You've got home, then civil jurisdiction, then commercial division, then banking and finance list. And the menus actually do the same thing. So we've got a situation where our breadcrumbs are syncing up with our menus, but then look at that URL at the top. The URL is countycourt.vic.gov.au/banking finance list. So the only bit of information that is presented in that URL is the name of the page. There's no information about where it actually sits in the structure of the site. Now, if you know AGOV or GovCMS at all, you'll probably recognise this as a site built on pretty much the default AGOV theme. So the point I want to make is definitely not to bash AGOV, because we love AGOV. It's to say that this is a Drupal thing. It's not something that is just magically fixed by using a distribution. And yeah, just another example of how easy it is to create unwieldy kind of structures in Drupal. This is a tourism site that we've been working with. If you look at this screen from a distance, it probably doesn't look too bad. It looks like it might be a list of taxonomy terms. No, it's not a list of terms, it's a list of vocabularies. So we've sort of inherited this site from a developer who didn't know Drupal very well, and what they did was they created a separate vocabulary for everything that should actually be a top-level term in a single vocabulary. And that causes all kinds of headaches when you have to do things like add term reference fields to content types, build views, or as we've actually had to do, split this site into two sites with the same configuration, but except that they have different vocabularies. So So it's this kind of thing that Drupal's flexibility gives you the ability to really make a mess. There's also a lot of potential for individual author error. So typically, as we've said, a single piece of content in Drupal has to be placed, often multiple times in menus and or taxonomy. So you might have to place the same piece of content in 2 different menus, plus sort of add a taxonomy tag. And often those, often it's unclear to authors, which of those things is actually sort of used for which. And a big bugbear of mine, if you give an author permission to create and edit URL aliases, they can manually override the entire alias. So everything from the domain name forward, they can just go in and change. If you've got a, doesn't matter how beautiful your URL structure is, an individual author can just go in and break that whole thing for an individual page. This is quite different from other content management systems that only allow you to edit the slug. So WordPress is a good example of this. In WordPress, the only thing an author can edit is the very last part of the URL. That's not the case in Drupal. So huge potential for author error. Now you might have noticed I've been going on a lot about URLs, and you might sort of think, well, are URLs really that important anymore? People aren't typing URLs directly into a browser as much as they used to. You've probably seen that browsers like Safari are starting to even sort of hide the full URL from users. We're entering a world where we might be, in a post-browser kind of universe in a few years' time. So do we really care that much about URLs from a usability point of view? But the fact is, we still need to care about URLs for a number of reasons. First one is that they still do help users form a mental map of the site, and it's especially users in situations where they don't necessarily have access to the kind of visual ways of sort of discovering the structure of a site, so the visual menus and so on. So 2 examples of that are a user looking at reading the site through a screen reader, a visually impaired user, or a user who's looking at a search result on a search results page. One of the main bits of information that Google gives you about a page is the URL. It's really helpful for users to be able to actually see something about where that page sits within the overall context of the site from that search results page. Secondly, Google itself uses URLs as a signal for the structure of the site, so it can actually help, URLs can actually help Google to build a picture of your site. And URLs, well-structured URLs also help you to segment content if you're using Google Analytics. If you've ever been into the content drill down view in Google Analytics, that will only work if you have well-structured URLs. There's a ton of other examples why URLs are really cool as well, but they're sort of my main 3. So you should care about URLs. Okay, so what's my advice? What do I think people should do who are building Drupal sites? I'm going to suggest, my one major piece of advice is to start by making a distinction between what I want to call mappable content versus self-mapping content. And I'll explain those terms, but a lot of people use the terms static and dynamic to sort of represent what I'm talking about. I don't really like the term static content because most content isn't actually static. It sort of sounds a bit, sounds like a bit of a negative thing. So I want to suggest introducing, at least to help me understand this, these alternative terms: mappable content, meaning content that you can place, that the user or the author actually sort of places somewhere in the navigation, versus self-mapping content, which is content that places itself depending on its kind of internal attributes. So just to explain what I mean, so our mappable content is the kind of content that doesn't change very often. It still changes, but it doesn't change as often as other content. It tends to be content that uses generic content types. So you'll find a lot of this mappable content in kind of standard page, the standard page content type. It's content that tends to have a default browsable navigation path. In other words, it tends to work well for users to find this content by sort of browsing through menus in a sort of predictable way. And for that reason, it suits a hierarchical form of organisation. So this kind of content is the kind of content that really suits being placed in menus and in kind of sitemaps and that kind of thing. On the other hand, self-mapping content this is the kind of content that we have that's sort of regularly updated or time sensitive. It's the kind of content that goes into custom content types, so it's what we love in Drupal. It's our articles and our events and our publications and all the things that we can add all kinds of fields to and do all kinds of fancy things in views. There tend to be sort of multiple dynamic navigation paths to this type of content, so there's multiple ways that people can find this content often. And for that reason, it doesn't fit so well in a hierarchy. So with self-mapping content, if you try to actually represent it in a sitemap, you'll often find yourself sort of drawing dotted lines to various sort of places, or using things like a page stack icon to represent, oh, this is where all the blog posts go. Whereas mappable content, you've got this is a single page, and it fits exactly sort of here on our sitemap. So, and most websites have both of these kinds of content, but in different proportions. One of the things about government sites is that they will often have a lot of mappable content, a lot of that traditional kind of content, and a lot of that sort of 20% content that the keynote speaker this morning talked about, the 20% content that accounts for 80% of your visits to the site, a lot of that's actually going to be in mappable content because it's your basic information that doesn't actually change very much. I think we need to take different approaches when we're talking about how to structure mappable content in Drupal versus sort of self-mapping content. So with mappable content, I really want to encourage you to go old school, to look at this content, to plan this content around a traditional kind of hierarchical, almost a Web 1.0 kind of sitemap, and to actually make this sitemap your single source of truth. And so that you make sure that you maintain a consistent structure across your menus and your URLs and your breadcrumbs. Apart from that, of course, when you're planning your sitemap, you need to be using kind of sound information architecture principles and techniques. And there's a great book that you can read on that, just been published in its 4th edition. The one sort of overriding principle, I think, is the DTO design principle to start with needs, and that means user needs, not government needs. Okay, so that's mappable content, and this is a good sort of default path auto pattern to use for mappable content, which basically means your URLs are going to follow the structure of your menu. I won't keep this up, but these slides will be available online, so don't feel like you have to copy that in a hurry. Self-mapping content, on the other hand, this is the kind of content that we love in Drupal because it's the kind of content that we get to fiddle about within views. It's really where Drupal comes into its own. But one thing that I see on a lot of Drupal sites is what I sort of call viewitis, which is the idea that we want to do everything in views that we possibly can. So, for example, because we can use exposed filters to let users filter the content by all kinds of attributes, let's let them filter by every single attribute that piece of content has. And what you'll find is that you can provide 5 different kinds of exposed filters. Users will usually only use 1 or 2 of them at the most. So that's where you really need to think about what's useful as well as what's possible, and make sure that you're testing your views with real content. This is the design with data principle, testing them against your user personas with real users if you possibly can, and then both before and after launch. So go back and look at your analytics, see which of these filters and things people are actually using, and think about sort of cutting back the ones that aren't being used. In terms of URLs for self-mapping content, look, I'm running out of time, so I don't want to go. I'll sort of skip over this slide, but because we don't have a single default navigation path for self-mapping content, kind of by definition, we do have to be a bit more creative with our URLs, and it's really a matter about thinking what pieces of information about this content are going to be most useful to expose to a user. And if you think about the user who's looking at this page in a search engine, think about, well, what might that user like to know about this page that I can expose through the URL? That's kind of a good way of thinking about it. Okay, so almost out of time, so I'm just going to summarise by quoting once more the DTO. We want to make it simple for our users, and in Drupal it's definitely the case that we have to do the hard work to make it simple. So that's all I've got. You can see a copy of these slides at our website, at WeaveWeb. Please follow us on Twitter, and probably got time for maybe one or two questions, if anyone has any. Yes, right.
A question as an addition to what you were saying about going crazy with content types and so on. We had a client site once that had a tag-based vocabulary.
Yeah.
Not a good thing to do. 12,703 tags.
Oh yeah.
Lots of them were like comma, dot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So letting authors add new tags. It's there's a use case for it, but yeah, your authors have to be really, really well trained if you're going to do that. And I think it's the same thing with letting authors edit the URL. If you're going to give them that permission, then make sure they understand what the URL structure is actually supposed to be, so they don't break it. Okay. Anything else? All right. We've done pretty well for time, so I'm happy about that. Thanks, everyone.